Dr. Gill is a professor and extension livestock specialist and association department head for extension. And also the program leader for Extension Animal Science faculty. Gill continues to provide leadership and extension programming related to animal well-being and low-stress livestock handling, and assists in providing leadership to statewide programming efforts for beef safety and quality assurance programming. Other interests include beef cattle and equine nutritional management and value-added marketing. He's a member of the beef cattle and equine sections in the Department of Animal Science, and he earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from Angelo State University and his doctorate from Texas A&M University. And I'll give us a little plug for BQA. If you're not Beef Quality Assurance certified, you can do that in a variety of ways. We would love to get you certified, but you can do that online right now at texasbeefquality.com. So if you want more information about the BQA program, Dr. Gill or myself can provide that information to you, and really encourage you that while you're doing some of this online programming, that you do go ahead and get certified in the Texas Beef Quality Assurance Program. So there's a little off script, but with that, Dr. Gill, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with everybody today. And like I said, I'll try to stop periodically and answer questions. One thing I've learned during this virtual training aspect we go through, that stopping periodically and catching up on questions is very beneficial, one, to the flow and everything else of the program. So if you have questions or you don't understand something I've said, some language or commentary, well, just let me know and we'll back up and cover that. With that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hopefully, and we'll start discussing some marketing options for calves. And there's a whole lot of different things that can be discussed in this process. So we'll kind of touch the main options. And because I don't know everybody's background and size of operation, this will be somewhat of a shotgun approach to doing this. But I'll try to go some for smaller operations and some for bigger operations as well in this process. All right. And this is the way most of us wind up marketing calves. We get one big one on the ground and then try to figure out what to do with it. And to me, marketing, if you do that, that's just selling calves. So if we really want to market things, we kind of have to figure out what our target is and what venue we're going to sell those cattle in, so we can make a plan and try to get those cattle to bring as much as they possibly can. If you're just selling, you're going to offer up an animal, and whatever somebody wants to bid on it that day will be what price you get. And to some extent, that's the way the beef cattle market has worked and worked for many, many years. But it's not the most efficient way to do this. So let's talk about some of these other ones. First of all, just kind of what are your options? You are limited sometimes in what you can do and how you can pursue based on the number of calves that are being sold or marketed off your ranch. And in reality, if you have less than 100 head of cattle, weaned calves to sell at any one time, you're somewhat limited in your options. The reason being, this industry functions in either buying and selling single animals or truckload lots. And there's not much room in between, and a truckload lot is 48 to 50,000 pounds of cattle. Even if you have less than 100 head of the same sex calves that are of the same age, you're also limited in options. So you can sell some mixed loads of cattle. I was reading, we say 100 head of calves sell at any one time. But if they're not the same sex, the same weight, same age, then you may not even be able to sell truckload lots of cattle. So that gets to be an issue for people that are trying to market cattle into the commodity trade. Let's put it that way. There's some things we can do to sell these cattle and make a little more money off of them. But every one of these other options require you to do more work and more things to get your cattle ready. So we'll talk about some of those. The primary options that we all have, of course, are livestock auctions. There's one in a county near you for most people in Texas. Private treaty, you can sell your calves to anybody, anytime. There are these satellite internet sales that are out there. They work really well. We'll talk a little bit more about them because they provide a lot of options. You can actually partner with somebody as you go sell your calves and let them share some of the risk in that association. And then you can just retain ownership outright of your cattle post weaning and sell your cattle later. And we keep talking about truckload lots. If you needed 100 head of 5-weight cattle, if you took them up to close to 1,000 pounds, you wouldn't need but 50 head of cattle to make a truckload lot. So sometimes the weight at which we sell them will also dictate how many we have to make that truckload lot work out. But like I said, for a lot of us, that's really not even an option. When we talk about livestock auctions, most everybody just thinks that if you take them to the auction, it's just taking them to the auction. Every auction, nearly every auction anyway, has a regular sale day. Just regular sales for cows, calves, bulls, whatever it might be. Some of them have special sales. Some of them even co-mingle calves from similar backgrounds. And they can market those calves in larger groups. And actually, the more cattle you have in a group, the more they will bring per pound. So if we can get up to a truckload lot, up until that point, those cattle bring more per pound because we have less transportation cost in them as a buyer. And so that's one reason the co-mingle sales, they put like kind of cattle together. Everybody takes that base price, and that gets to be a problem. Some people, if you think your cattle are better than the base, then you may not want to participate in those, but consider those anyway. And then most auctions have a special consignment sale from time to time where they may sell replacement cattle or stocker feeder cattle. And a stocker calf is one that's been weaned off a cow or is coming off the cow and ready to go to grass. And if they're bigger kind of cattle that weigh 600 to 800 pounds, they'll probably be classified as feeders. So those are specialized sales. And then there's some different requirements within those as well. We'll talk about a little bit later. And then livestock auctions, a lot of them also manage what we'd call country sales. If you've got a set of calves that you don't want to bring to the barn, you can contact the auction and they can act as your intermediate person to get that transaction done. And so you don't necessarily have to negotiate with a buyer, but the livestock auction can do that for you, and they'll take a commission. All of those sales will be based off of a commission, and most commissions are 2.5% to 3%. The country sale might be negotiable, but once again, that's an option. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those as later. Private treaty is one that we see in this COVID time frame. A lot of people really talking about selling some cattle, either in the beef or just to one another for use as beef. But you can have cash sales with anybody anytime, so that's always an option. The interesting part of that, you have to know what they're worth to make that work. And so you do have to study market reports and know what cattle are worth as you try to sell them, either as singles or sell a little group of them or sell some for beef, whether it be grass-fed, finished at home, whatever it might be. The other thing you can do is negotiate a forward contract on your cattle, particularly if you have truckload lots or selling into an alliance. You can negotiate what that price will be down the road. And once again, you got to know the markets. You got to, once again, be cautious about downturns in the market, or if the market goes up, and you've already agreed to sell your cattle for a certain amount, you can't really afford to back out of those contract sales, or you won't ever have that option again. So those are still options. You can also commingle your cattle with somebody else's and sell them private. That happens quite often, but a lot of people don't think about it. So if your neighbor or people that are breeding cattle very similar to yours want to, y'all can all go together and sell your cattle. And that happens quite a bit in areas where they don't have a local auction market that's pretty close. And so that can allow you to do that. And so once again, there's a lot of different things you can do. Also, you can sell your cattle directly into some of these alliances, or what we call program cattle, and we'll talk about those in just a minute as well. But somebody wants to buy your cattle back, for example. We'll talk about 44 Farms is an operation here in Texas that does a lot of that. And so that would be one of, if you use their bulls, you can sell cattle back into their alliance on a private treaty basis. The satellite and internet sales, the big advantage to these, that is the largest pool of buyers that's available. So you have more people that'll tune in every week looking for cattle on those big internet sales. And so you have a lot of competitive bidding there, but once again, they all are looking for certain types of cattle. And they have orders. I hadn't talked about that. We'll get into that a little bit later as to how that works. But nearly all of these sales deal in truckload lots. You can sell a mixed load of steers and heifers. What they'll normally do is sell for a certain price on the steers, and then they agree to sell the heifers at so many dollars per pound or per hundredweight under that. And very often they cheapen the heifers up quite a bit because they're really after the steers. They don't necessarily want the heifers. You can forward contract through internet sales as well. You can put your cattle on the internet sale anytime and have them expected delivery months later. That's kind of a forward contract. You can sell commingled cattle on the internet sales as well. And satellite sales, the deal is there, those companies will only deal with one person, so you got to trust who you're dealing with, that they won't sell your cattle and keep them. Then you'll have to get some of the cattle raisers, investigators involved. And for the most part, these satellite internet sales target mainstream cattle. So if you have a niche breed, or something that's not really mainstream, this is probably not going to be the best route for you. Although I've seen some sport cattle, what we'd call roping cattle or something, sell through these sales as well and actually do pretty fairly well. So you just have to deal with a broker in those cases. And each one of these companies has a representative, they call them reps, that will come out and work with you and making up your contract and what you want for your cattle and what all has been done to them. We'll discuss that a little more as well. But they also have special sales that are available for breeding stock, or like I said, these sport cattle that might be sold into those as well. The partnership deals, if you want to retain ownership past a certain point, a lot of times the cash flow of the cow-calf operation will suffer so much because you won't have a calf crop to sell in that year. You can partner with a feeding operation or something to maintain the ownership of those cattle further down the road. But normally, once again, they're dealing in truckload lots of 100, 200 head. But they're looking at trying to get light kind of cattle put together, normally to go to a feedlot at some point in time, but not necessarily. Sometimes they'll go to pasture first. The other partnership deal allows you to participate in the post-weaning performance and the quality of the cattle that you produced. So if you think you have superior genetics, but you don't necessarily have the means or wherewithal or confidence to go ahead and feed those cattle, you can partner with somebody and allow yourself to capture some of that value back. The other part of that next bullet, allows you to participate in post-weaning market fluctuations. And so if you had not sold your cattle, for example, but we're going to partner with some that we're going to come out during this COVID wreck we've been in, you would have got a pretty rude awakening and a lot smaller check than you might have anticipated otherwise. So that is something you got to be concerned with. The other side, the market can turn up and you actually benefit from the market change. More often than not, the downturns are bigger than those little upticks in the market over time. So keep that in mind. Marketing into alliances is still, once again, you can do that through partnerships as well. If you decide to retain ownership in your cattle, you can retain ownership post-weaning through a weaning phase. You can go through a backgrounding phase, a stocker phase, the feeder phase, and sell them as fat cattle into the packing plant. So you can do everything you want to do in a retained ownership. It just depends on how far you want to retain ownership. Most people consider retaining ownership being all the way through to the packer, and that's not necessarily, it's certainly not required and not the normal thing we'd see. So we'll look at that and see where you think you have the expertise, the knowledge, and where you can actually add value to your cattle through that process. The first three options there, whether you precondition them, background them, or go through a stocker phase, means you still have to market them through one of these other previously outlined methods we talked about. And if you retain into the feed yard, you're going to have at least a pen to participate at the feed yard. And 40 head is kind of a very minimum that you might do at a feed yard. Most of these pens at the feed yard are running either 100 to 500 head of cattle. They can commingle. They don't like to do that. So once again, if you're retaining ownership, you kind of want to know what your cattle are eating. You want them to be fed your ration and your feed cost to calculate it accordingly. So that is something that you can think about, and don't just think about retained ownership all the way through. Anytime you wean them and keep them for 20 days, 30 days, 45 days, whatever it might be, you are in a retained ownership program. If you are going to sell these cattle out front, even in retained ownership, you can forward contract those cattle. You also need to get somebody to work with you on the futures and also perhaps some options. And so if you don't understand those things, that's a whole nother discussion and topic. But, you know, when COVID hit this cattle market, the people that had their cattle protected with futures contracts did not lose the money. They made up the difference on their futures contracts. And so it wasn't financially devastating for those people. They may not have made as much money, but they were not financially devastated. And that's a big part of trying to protect yourself when you're retaining ownership, at least in through the feed yard. Futures contracts don't work and aren't designed really for anything other than fed cattle. There is a stocker cattle contract, but it's not traded enough that we actually have real good protection there, but it is something that you could think about as well. But unless you're good at it, get somebody to help you work through the contracting phase of that. All right, let's go back and look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of some of these. On livestock auctions, all producers have access to the competitive bids on their calves. So every time a calf comes in the auction, the buyers that are sitting there, they may or may not have an order, and maybe I ought to back up. Or a lot of people have heard the term order buyer, and that refers to someone who buys for multiple people at each auction. So if I needed to buy cattle and Stacy Fox needed to buy cattle, we could ask Joe Bob to go up there and buy us cattle. So he would have two orders for cattle. And we could specify the weight we wanted, the breed type, sex of the cattle, all sorts of specifications could be placed on that order. And not only would he buy for Stacy and I, he might buy for other people as well. A lot of those guys will have 10 or 12 orders every day. They're sitting in the sale barn. And you hear this all the time. Well, they only had 4 buyers there. Well, they may have been 4 buyers in the auction, but they are buying for multiple people every day. And so that's where the competitive nature of that comes from. And they try to have orders for nearly everything that will come through an auction. Even the cattle that are lower value, somebody wants them. And so there's somebody that sometimes they get called bottom feeders. So it's the ones that are buying the lower value cattle, the ones that aren't mainstream, they'll actually be in the bidding process for those. Normally get them bought a lot cheaper, but somebody's willing to take them. All right. The best thing about going to an auction, you don't have to study the market and price your calves to the prospective buyer. But you probably ought to know what that market is. So if you don't think your calves are receiving enough of a bid or cows, you can actually PO them there just like you can any other auction. And so if you really believe that your cattle are being sold way under the market, you probably ought to PO them, bring them home, or take them to a different market later. There's some risk with bringing cattle home from a market, and it's a biosecurity risk. If you've taken them up there, they're exposed to things in the markets, and you bring them home, there can be issues. The other thing about it, these markets are available about 50 weeks out of the year. They take a couple of weeks off every year, but that's about all. So if you need washing machine money, you can load something up, take them to town, and get paid for it. And that is the main advantage to the livestock market. It's readily available cash. There are markets that sell every day of the week except Sunday. And so even if you can't make a Monday sale, you can make a Tuesday sale, you can make a Wednesday sale somewhere else. And so these things are running about 6 days a week, 50 weeks out of the year. They do have the opportunity for special sales, and so look for those. Some of the better barns will actually have these special sales. And the best thing about a livestock market, your calves don't have to be uniform. If we're selling in truckload lots, they need to all look alike, be the same size, the same sex, all that. In a livestock market, because the order buyers, they are the ones that start building uniformity in the calves that are going to the next phase of production. So as he's sitting there with an order, and his order is to buy 5-weight heifers, black heifers, then he just buys 5-weight black heifers all day. He also may have an order for 7-weight Charolais crosses. And so he starts buying those uniform groups, and he may buy one from you, one from somebody else, 10 from somebody. And so that's how uniformity is built in the livestock industry, is through these purchases and sorting of cattle into similar outcomes. And so that's one main advantage or use and utility of livestock markets, is to start building that uniformity. Now, we'll say they don't have to be uniform if you want good price for them, but they got to be good. They have to have muscling, frame, condition. We'll talk some more about that in a minute. But they don't all have to be the same size, the same sex, the same age for this to work. In working with an auction barn and getting as much as they can for your calves, the number one thing is that you've got to bring cattle up there that several people that are buying have orders for them. And so if you've got something that's really out of the norm, there's not going to be an order sitting there for you with multiple people to where that competitive bidding is going to kick in. And so that's where we see a lot of people, and I'll pick on in local market up here in North Texas in Wise County. They sell a lot of longhorn cross calves or longhorn calves. None of the order buyers are really sitting there with competitive bids to buy those calves. So those calves normally sell at $40 to $60 per hundredweight under beef cattle. And so they are not the ones in demand for the beef industry. And so I'm not picking on longhorns because there's a market for them. There's things that are really good utility about them, but you have to realize why they don't bring the money that some of the others. Part of it is those cattle are lighter muscled, they perform less, they produce less meat. And so if they're going into mainstream production, they are not the the type of calves that are in demand by the buyers. There's really not any breed that maximizes and optimizes all these 3 M's. And I don't remember there being sound to this slide, but there is. Maternal traits. Some people are in the market to buy replacement females. And so maternal traits are important to those people. Muscle is important to all of us, but if we're on the maternal side, we may not want that much muscle in our cows because it adds to maintenance cost. And so there's a balancing act there. And then marbling is another one of those. A lot of us in the cow-calf business has spent a lot of time purchasing bulls to improve the marbling in our calves, but we don't own our calves long enough to reap the benefit of that. So we're paying extra money for sires, trying to get more marbling, eating quality in our calves, which is a great thing, but we're selling calves based on pounds, not potential to marble. And we get in trouble for saying this sometimes, but we want cattle that will perform, grow at the cow-calf level, that look the part and have some expected genetic. If I've got an animal that really got really good muscle, really good marbling genetics, I'm probably going to want to maintain ownership in that animal at least until it's in a beef form to capture that value. If not, you've really got to market that genetics to get paid for it. Otherwise, you're not getting paid for those additional marbling genetics in your breed. And marbling is what causes cattle to be classified as choice or prime or something like that, if you're not familiar with that terminology. All right, what type of calf will produce the ideal end product? And I'm not saying everybody needs to do that, but it is one of those issues you got to think about what that ideal calf will be and what it looks like. I'm going to address this 45-day question as we get in here just a little bit further. So if I don't answer it specifically, we'll get back to that. All right. Breed versus type. Everybody gets hung up on breeds because we find a breed we like. I have to tell you, I raise red cattle, and a guy came up to me to buy the cattle one time at the ranch, and he said, I can't tell what breed these cattle are. And that was my objective, because there's always a breed bias. And that sounds funny, but I don't want him to think, well, they got too much of this or too much of that. If he can't tell what's in them, but all he knows is they're good calves, then I've actually done what I want to have, and I've got my breed type like I need. The types are those, and this has been defined a little bit by the feedlot side of it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if they're half British and half continental, that would be one of the prime examples. That would be an Angus Charolais cross or an Angus Simmental cross. Those are 50% British, 50% continental. Another one might be a Hereford or Red Angus on those same continental breeds, or Limousin, Maine Anjou, or continental breeds. That is a really good feeder calf. It takes advantage of the marbling and growth traits of that combination, and that's why buyers like it. The other part of that is we have more heterosis in the health of those cattle. They don't get sick as often as a purebred animal would. We use the analogy a lot of times of an old mutt dog. You can't make an old mutt sick. But if you buy a purebred dog, you're at the vet getting something done to them nearly all the time. And that's one of the differences between that heterosis effect in genetics and health. Another type that works pretty good are these quarter British, quarter Zebu or Brahman influence, and half continental. That would be like your F1 Brahman Hereford cross or F1 Angus Brahman with a continental bull on them, that Charolais, Simmental, Limousin, Maine Anjou kind of cross. Those are good end product kind of cattle. So think about this. We're talking about the animals that are going for beef. Now, look at that breakup there, and that 25% British, 25% Zebu means you had a half-blood Brahman cow in your operation, at least. And so remember, this is end product, not necessarily the female side of it that we're talking about. The other one that works pretty good are these half-blood British Zebu cattle back with a British breed on them. Don't have to go to Continental. There's a lot of good terminal genetics in the British breed as well. That being Hereford, Angus, Red Angus, and even Shorthorn. This was kind of a script put out years ago by a feeding company. There's some good things and bad things about it, but they said a minimum of 25% British. So a minimum of Angus, 25% Angus, Red Angus, Hereford, Shorthorn. Those are our British breeds. Now, there are some other British breeds that, like the British Whites and those kind of things, they really don't fit this unless you can cover that color pattern up. And we'll talk a little bit more about color in a minute. They don't really want more than 50% Continental exotic genetics in them because they don't marble quite as well as they should. Now, there are exceptions to that rule, but that's kind of the minimum 25, maximum 50%. And most people will say in the calf that you're selling, a maximum of 25% Brahman influence. Now, keep in mind, that's for the end product. If I'm raising cows, I may want 50% Brahman in them because of the heat tolerance, hybrid vigor, fertility that we'd have. Extremes of any kind are generally less value. And with the exception, if you had some straight bred Brahman heifers, there's probably not any female worth more than those straight bred gray Brahman heifers. And so just keep that in mind. If you've got something that doesn't fit mainstream, where do they fit? And you can market those cattle accordingly. Already kind of talked about that. And I put this picture up there because those heifers in that picture are Red Angus, Beefmaster, and Gelbvieh crosses. I hadn't mentioned Gelbvieh, but that is another Continental breed of cattle. So even though they've got some Brahman influence in them, you really can't tell it if it's less than 25%. So once again, a lot of people don't realize what those cattle will look like once they're put together genetically, but they can be pretty darn good cattle with that combination. Something else you can do, if you've got cattle that are going to be going to the barn, an auction barn, and you've put some effort into getting them ready, call the barn and let them know you're coming. Now, if you just got one or two calves, that may not be worth doing. But if I've got very many, I'm going to call them and let them know I'm bringing them. That way they can contact any prospective buyers that may not routinely be at the auction, and they can either put an order in for them or somebody can show up to try to bid on those calves. The other thing, in certain times of the year, that reserving pen space is pretty important. So don't be afraid to work with your auction market. They're there to help you sell cattle. The more they bring, the more money in their pocket. Remember, this is a commission sale. And so they want your cattle to bring as much as they possibly can. That last line is really important. Manage your calves to make them easy to market. Here's some things to do. Reducing shrink, and if those of you that don't understand shrink, any other business that you might be in, if stuff walks out the door and you don't get paid for it, that's shrink. In cattle, if they lose gut feel, they're stressed, anything that comes out of that body before they walk across the scales of an auction market creates shrink. And so calves are routinely shrink about 10% from the time you take them off your ranch, particularly if you fresh wean them, take them off the cow and haul them to the auction market, they'll normally shrink about 10%. We can manage that by teaching them how to eat. We can wean them. All those things cut down that stress from pulling them off the cow and hauling them to the auction market. Teaching them to eat's a big thing. Getting them accustomed to people. If they're wild and they're bouncing off the walls the entire time at the auction, you may have 12 to 15% shrink in your cattle. So getting them accustomed to people, being handled, the biggest thing you can do to make all that work is to wean those calves prior to the sale. But you have to do it where you can make money at it. If you're having to buy a lot of feed and wean calves prior to sale and spend too much money, you're not going to make your money back. I'm looking at this question to make sure I get it. That question on the 45 days is earnest money. Most of the time that will be like a 10% or something like that. It's not going to make you whole if somebody defaults on a contract, but it's enough they don't want to lose their money. And so unless the market really turns against them, they normally won't walk away from a contract. So get as much as you can. Sometimes it may not be 10%, but there will be some money put up front for that. All right. We talked about auction markets, and any other questions on auction markets, I'd be glad to take them as well. But in the interest of time, we'll keep going through the private treaty. The biggest issue here, all of us can do it. There's not competitive bids. You have to know what the value is. You have to be able to negotiate and market your cattle. So knowing what they're worth and being able to stick to your guns is important. All right. So the other thing it allows you to do is to market into these niche markets, whether it be replacement heifers, some kind of specialty market, whether it be grass-fed or pasture-finished beef or grain-finished beef at your place, allows you to do that. And then also some of these special alliances that I'll talk about in a minute. But these may require some special management prior to or at weaning. Knowing your buyers is really important. What are they really after? If they're bargain shoppers, you probably don't want them at your place. Know what the market is. Study these market summaries. USDA Ag Marketing Service puts out a weekly summary of cattle prices at all the auction markets across the state. So everybody has a record of what cattle prices are. And that should be a place you kind of start from to kind of see what the market will bear in this environment. And remember, you can take a little less because you're not paying commission. If you're going to an auction market, you're probably paying commission, so you've got to get more money to have the same amount of dollars. Be flexible in what you're going to be willing to do and willing to negotiate on and get those calves sold. A lot of people really get hung up on they want this amount, and they're not going to change their mind for anything in the world. No, be realistic in what your cattle are worth and what you think you can get for them. If you are putting additional management in there, make sure you get paid for that. So if you're weaning those calves at home, don't just go off the calf price that's in that market report, because there's also a market report in there for calves that are weaned. And so make sure you're pricing them accordingly. Know what you're going to be willing to accept and be realistic. A lot of us have a higher opinion of our cattle than most everybody else does. This is another one. What condition is required on cattle to net the most dollars? I haven't got into condition and some of the other factors that will affect value, and that's kind of a different discussion. But a lot of us want our cattle really fleshy and have a lot of baby fat on these calves coming straight off the cow. We'll tell you that the buyers don't particularly like that in calves going through auction markets. But if I'm selling breeding stock, I better have them a little pudgy. If I'm showing show prospects or something like that, they better be a little fat. Stocker feeder cattle, not so much. They want them lower condition, less fat on them when they purchase them, so they don't have that. They want to be able to put that gain on them very efficiently. And then what are the health requirements of some of these markets as well? VAC 45 has kind of become the standard for marketing cattle that are weaned. And so you need to understand what VAC 45 really is. Satellite internet sales, the uniformity is such a big deal there. Quality of calves is paramount, but the age, weight, and sex is really important. You can sell the same sex, uniform age, weight, condition, and health. That is what the buyers in those truckload lots are looking for. That's a set of heifers that white, they've got a little Brahman influence in them, a little Charolais, but those cattle are not really fat, but those would be really ideal cattle to sell in an internet sale or even in a live auction. The other thing you hear them talked about, medium and large framed English and exotic cattle that are average to heavy muscled. And that's kind of what we see in that picture. So they don't all have to be uniform like these white ones, but they're uniform in type here, not color necessarily, not necessarily even breed, but the type of animal is pretty consistent. And this would be actually probably a put together set of cattle that were bought by an order buyer for a certain weight in some continental British contract. I don't know exactly what it'd be because looking at them, there's a little bit of everything in that mix, but they have some muscle and some frame to them. I mentioned this earlier, work with a rep with a satellite or internet company to make sure you get your cattle listed correctly. Make sure you document all your management on that consignment sheet because that will be how they're advertised. And you got to know what you're going to take for the cattle once you do that, because you have 2 minutes from the time they sell the cattle till you PO them. If you don't like the sale, they will let you PO them a lot of times and then rerun them on the next sale without additional charges. So once again, you have to know when the gavel comes down if that's the price you're going to take. You got just a little bit of time to worry about that. But there's a whole host of options for listing cattle on these sales, and we'll go through some of those in just a minute as well. You got to have them exactly as they're represented. There's nothing that will wreck a sale on an internet or satellite because these cattle are bought sight unseen other than maybe a video or a picture. So when they go to pick them up, if they are not exactly as represented, they have the right of refusal on those cattle, and they will do that. So you have to represent them correctly in these consignments. Make sure you consign early enough that you can fulfill all your requirements of the contract, whether you're weaning, vaccinating, and you need to deliver the cattle regardless of what the market does. I know a lot of people really want to, if the market goes up, they want to pull the cattle out. They don't think they sold them for enough. Well, that'll be the last time you get to really say anything about that. So good question come up in the Q&A. What does PO mean? That's mean pull out. And you actually pull them out of the sale. And so that just means that you don't want to sell them. You may have to pay some yardage and commission fees to take them home, but you do not have to sell them for that price that's bid on them. Good question. We're not going to spend a lot of time on partnerships and retained ownership, but you really have to budget this thing out to see if it's going to work and be realistic and see if the upside potential justifies the downside potential, because we're retaining ownership through a period of time when we might be able to sell the cattle. And also remember that it's hard to go broke selling cattle at a profit. So if you know what your costs are, anytime in that retained ownership program, you need to be willing to sell the cattle for profit. Some people get so locked into making sure I want to own them all the way through the feedlot that they probably could have sold them at some other point and made money on them and guaranteed that. You don't have to know that and don't have to do it, but you do need to understand what your expected performance is on growth and carcass characteristics, particularly if you're going all the way to what we call the rail or in the packing plant. Make sure you got the finances in order to do that. Particularly if your operating money is coming from the bank, they need to realize you're not going to make a payment this year. The other part is don't overestimate the quality of your cattle. Be realistic in what they're willing to do. If you're retaining ownership, one of the things you really have to do is manage the health of those cattle first and foremost. I don't care how good a carcass they might produce. If they get sick, they'll never produce that quality carcass. And if they get sick, they might die. And so health is critical in anything moving forward out of your operation. So that's why VAC 45 cattle sell at a premium, and you have to understand how to make that work and cost effectively. And once again, that's another discussion. In fact, I think Stacy was going to have me talk about weaning options at the Cattlemen's College at their convention, and hopefully we'll still get to do that at some point in time. But that is a management must that we get that done correctly. You do have to control costs there, because if you spend too much money there, you can't make it up later on. Have calves that are genetically designed to provide that expected performance. You can't make them better than what they're genetically destined to be. So retained ownership takes a lot of planning, a lot of forethought to get that done and done correctly. But it is an option. Know where you're headed. If you're just going to the pasture phase of it, you want cattle that grow fast. Don't necessarily worry about carcass. If you're going to the feedlot, going and sell into the beef, then once again, having that carcass merit in the cattle is really important. I just talk about if you had a bunch of big heifers, don't destine them to go somewhere other than a feedlot or replacements. By this time, they're already too late for replacements. So think about that when you're putting cattle together, where they might go. Another one we talk about are program cattle, and that's kind of a confusing term, but there are different programs around that if you do certain things, you have certain breed characteristics, that will allow your cattle to go into that program. We're going to talk a little bit more about those as we go. You can find a program that matches what you currently do. There's a lot of people don't do hardly anything to their calves. They don't implant. They don't treat them with antibiotics because they don't have to. Well, if that's the case, find you a program that will pay you extra for not doing what you already don't do. Sounds kind of silly, but if you're not going to do it and take advantage of some of these technologies such as implants, for goodness sake, sell them into a program that pays you a little bit extra to have what we call natural cattle. Okay. Sometimes you may actually want to add some production practices to match a particular program. That would be weaning programs, and that kind of stuff will actually add some value to those cattle as well. There are a couple of places, and looks like Stacy's recording this, so you can go back and look at this, but if you'll just search USDA certified beef programs, these couple of websites will come up. The first one is actually program cattle, existing programs that USDA has oversight over in verifying that these cattle fit the specifications laid out in these are what we call process verified programs, or PVPs. The other one, the bottom listing there, is another approved process verified programs for calves primarily. So I'm going to actually take you in and look at a couple of those right quick. I'm going to escape out of this one, and then I'm going to share a different screen, hopefully. And we've got this list of all these different programs. And you can tell there's quite a few of them, right? This one here is 44 Farms I mentioned earlier. Also look across here, most of these are chasing Angus cattle. And so the certified Angus beef program kind of built a niche, and then these different programs have developed underneath that umbrella. But they're not always that way. Here's a certified Hereford beef program. So if you have Hereford, there's also one for Red Angus cattle. And so different breeds have different things, but this one is just necessarily their cattle that they've branded and verify what they do to it. So there's a whole list of these things, but a big number of them are all chasing this Angus product. Here's another Omaha Hereford beef. So once again, there's a lot of different things out there, but it has all the specifications. And these are meat programs, okay? Hart Brand is another one we see in Texas, Akaushi cattle. Once again, these are all out there. So if you have cattle that fit into one of these programs, you can look at it. Nolan Ryan, we have those in Kroger stores all over the state, and it's all natural tender aged beef. They do not have a breeds specification. So what this is kind of a cooler sort. So any cattle can go into it, but you really can't produce cattle necessarily for that program because they're just sorting carcasses within the coolers. Here's the one, Where Food Comes From. This is just a verified program of source and process that the cattle have gone through. So you can go on each one of these companies' sites and figure out what that is. Tyson Packing Plant has their own certified premium beef. It's not breed specific. So once again, good quality cattle can go into that scenario. I may not be able to do what I plan on doing here. I'm going to close that one. Now this is a listing of process verified programs. And a lot of people, if you want to get on this website, this is the second website, but it tells you what is required, what these process verified points are, what livestock, what's required to do that. And there's a whole list of those. So this one, Angus Link is a big one. They have something for every Angus animal out there. Here's a care and handling according to BQA has to be done as well. They've got different tiers of that. Here's some for the program for the People's Republic of China. So we get down to really go to being very specific about what we can do with some of this. So there's a lot of things you can do. You just have to figure out what you want to do with some of this stuff. Okay. All right. Hopefully we're back to the slides now and we'll keep going. I'm going to run through Superior Video Auction is one of those that we see a lot of things up there. And there's a lot of things that come into play. And Steve, I'll get your question as well as we get into. And then there's one here about processing cattle and selling to the end consumer. There is a real need for that. It is a growing trend. And the problem is we don't have enough packers or local plants to keep up with the demand right now. So make sure if you're going to sell cattle directly in the beef, that you have your relationship with a processor so you can get them killed in a timely fashion and don't get stuck with cattle. Because right now, a lot of these plants are booked 6 to 12 months in advance. And so we'll keep that in mind. All right, Steve, we'll get into your question here on vaccines in just a second. Notice all this VAC 24, 34, 34 plus, 45, 45 plus, 60, and pre-con. Those are all value-added calf vaccination protocols. This 24 means that you vaccinated your calves at 2 to 4 months of age. You may not have revacced them since then. 34 means they were vaccinated 3 to 4 weeks prior to weaning. 45 means they were vaccinated and prior to weaning and after weaning and weaned for 45 days. Vac 60 means they were actually weaned and for 60 days. Pre-con and 24 through 60 are all ranch raised calves. Vac pre-con means you can purchase calves, put together like groups, precondition them, and then sell them back in a VAC 45 kind of program. This can be done through Superior. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Net Bio program over in East Texas, run through that auction market at Sulphur Springs. They also have a lot of preconditioned calves come back through that. Back up here. And I've got a bunch of these slides that go through all the specifications on this, and I don't really think we need to do that. I will tell you, in most of these programs, they require a modified live vaccine. So Steve is going to kind of get back to your question. The reason they do is modified live vaccines, given correctly, provide a higher level of immunity than killed vaccines do. There are some risks with modified lives. If your cow herd has not been vaccinated with a modified live at some point in time, and some of you are going to be asking what a modified live and a killed is, we'll get to that in just a minute. But if your cow herd has not ever been vaccinated with a modified live, vaccinating your calves may cause them to shed some viruses, and that actually abort the cow. So that's the concern most people have with modified lives. Personally, I make sure all of my cows, our replacement heifers, and any cows coming into the herd have been vaccinated with a modified live while they're not pregnant. And that way I can use any vaccine I want anytime after that. And modified lives are one that I think provide a higher level of immunity. Killed vaccines work very good if given properly. That means 2 doses, just as on the label requires. They will establish a fairly good level of immunity. And so that's something to think about as well, as how much are you willing to risk or how much are you willing to do. But if you can work your cows twice and give them the vaccine like they should, the killed will work. It will not work as well as a modified live vaccine in establishing baseline immunity. There's some argument on that. I understand that. But the data shows that for the most part, modified lives are more effective. So on calves going into a VAC 45 program or one of these listed here below, they have to have a modified live vaccine or they can't qualify for that program. And so that's where I made a comment earlier. You have to know what the specifications are and whether or not you can actually make that work for you. The other one question that come in there is thoughts on implants or going all natural. Good question from Donald on modified lives. Let me answer that one. Modified lives do not require a booster. What a lot of people do will revaccinate with a modified live because you don't always get immunity with the first dose. There are some modified lives that only recommend you give 1 dose. And I think we over-vaccinate cattle with modified lives much more than we don't vaccinate enough. And so really, if my cattle are stress-free, good nutrition, 1 dose of modified live is adequate. Now, they do recommend you revaccinate. If you look on the label, it says revaccinate, not booster. On a killed vaccine, it says to boost that vaccine, and you have to do that for it to be effective. So once again, you got to understand your vaccines and work with your veterinarian to make sure you get all that done and done correctly. Hopefully that answered that question. But they do not require to, but there may be instances where giving the second one is beneficial if your cattle may be stressed a little bit. All right. Implants. The implants are, they will add about 13% to your growth rate. And so if cattle are gaining a pound a day and you give them an implant, they'll gain 1.13 pounds a day or something along those lines. So they can really give you a boost in efficiency. If we castrate bull calves and give them an implant, they'll grow just like they would if they were intact males. There's no real reason to implant heifers, particularly if you're going to keep them for replacement, so we don't normally recommend that. But to John's question on whether or not I think you should, that's up to you. If you don't want to do it, realize what you're giving up, that's fine. But if you don't implant, sell those calves into a program that is looking for verified natural calves. There's a little bit of premium for those cattle. It's not enough to offset the weight loss or lack of gain that you'll get by using an implant. that make sense? So if I implant them, they're going to gain more, and I'm going to make more money if I implant them than what they're going to pay me or a premium on non-implanted cattle. But if you don't want to implant them, for goodness sake, sell them to where you get the premium. Either that, you're just not getting a premium, and you're not getting any additional gain. And so you're kind of losing twice. So make sure that you do manage those cattle accordingly. And I'm going to run through this Superior stuff real quick. And I'm not promoting Superior. This is just to show you how many program cattle options there are. And these are all on their website, so you don't need to read through all these. But these are all audited processes that have to be verified and audited to make sure it works. And that some of them, this is just agent source. Not many people do that anymore because there's not really a premium for it right now. If there's a premium for it, we'll get after it. If you have progressive genetics, this is interesting. So if you have certain genetics in your cattle, you can go through this program and actually get them marketed differently. This one is basically, if you don't understand slides, and I talked about shrink a while ago, and then these cattle are sold on satellite auctions because we don't know what they weigh the day we sell them. A slide is placed on the price. So if they weigh too much, then the price backs off per pound. And it can go the other way. If they're lighter than the contract, they can add money to it. That doesn't happen very often, so you got to be really careful about what you're doing. The other thing we think about in understanding a slide is important. So make sure you do understand it. We actually have a publication that Dr. Rick Machin and I put together several years ago. It's understanding how to calculate a slide, because I've seen some people lose a lot of money not understanding how the slide works. And this is a new one, weight stop. Now, think about this, because we don't know what cattle weigh, and we're guessing what they weigh, and we sell them. And these contracts got to where people were selling calf crops, and then their calf crop was weighing a whole lot more than what they predicted it to be. And people had figured out that they could price the cattle at a lower weight, and then the slide was actually in their favor as the cattle went up. So they put in this weight stop that if the cattle go over a certain amount, that's free to the buyer. You got to really understand that little program before you get too excited about it. There's some that are going through, and we can get into bovine viral diarrhea, and persistently infected is what PI stands for. That really sets cattle up for respiratory issues. So you can actually test your cattle and verify them as BVD free. Non-hormone treated cattle, these cattle are going to Europe primarily. They are not implanted. This is one of those programs you can sell cattle into. The advantage to the non-hormone treated cattle versus natural cattle can't be treated with antibiotics. Non-hormone treated cattle can be. There's no discrimination against that. It's just the implant that they don't want them to be treated with. There are GAP certifications from the Global Animal Partnership. A lot of people are pursuing these GAP certifications because there is premium paid for those cattle if you can be certified and have enough cattle to sell into that program. So think about it. I've seen some very large ranches that are GAP certified all the way up to GAP 4. There is a GAP 5, but it's one that most cow-calf guys are not going to do. The calves are never weaned. Every calf just have to be kicked off naturally. I don't think you can haul them to auction or to slaughter. They have to be processed on the ranch. So that's a really different scenario there. But if you want to look at those, Global Animal Partnership is where you get them. That's just talking about how that works. They're certified natural, we talked about, plus, and this is just a affidavit program. There's a verified natural beef. Vitamin companies, mineral companies have programs where you can verify that you're feeding their product. Genetic merit programs, the Angus Link we mentioned earlier, all of those are programs that are available not only through satellite, but also through group sales as well. All right, there's actually a Beefmaster. I forgot about that. But E6 program is focused more on females, than it is on steers, but it is one that is available to people. We talked about certified Angus, there's integrity beef, so we can really get into a lot of programs. This is if the Red Angus genetics, this is if they just kind of look age and source verified, you don't have to verify genetics, all sorts of stuff. So with that said, you can say good luck on marketing, but that's not all we want to talk about. I had a question. Well, Mr. Davis got a couple of good ones. Who can he talk to about futures contracts on feedlot cattle? There are commodity traders and people that do that. There's folks at National Credit Finance, I know, that do some of that as well. So you'll have to shop that around. I can't necessarily give you the name of somebody to go see about that, but that is something, Mr. Davis, you'd need to really look into. You asked about the article on slides. That article, if you go to a website called beef.tamu.edu, that's tamu.edu, and I'll try to type that answer in here as well. In the publications, you can find that. I'll get it in here, maybe right.
Dr. Gill, I'll also, if you're okay with it, I'll link to it in the follow-up email that the recordings and stuff, so everybody has
access to that. That'll work. Let's see, is anything else? We've already got John's question answered on all natural, no implants. Anything? There was some in the chat. Are those some we need to look at, Stacy?
Let me take a look.
You've been answered most of those, right?
I think so. There was some questions about the recording, and we are recording this, and it'll be available tomorrow. Yep, I think that we've got everything right now.
Okay. Are there any other questions that I can stumble through? If not, that's a quick down and dirty on marketing. So if anybody, I'm not sure what I did there, but
I did have a question. July's meeting on site? No, we'll be virtual again in July. I'm not sure when we'll be back meeting in the office, but hopefully soon. But when we do, we'll also try to continue doing some of this online as well. It's harder to do a hybrid event than it is to do either just online or just live, but we are working on some solutions there. But we'll be back virtual in July.
I love this anonymous attendee up here. Can I sell to a friend and not worry about my legal problems? Not necessarily. All right. If you are selling beef to anyone, you have to sell that beef out of a plant that is either state or federally inspected. So you cannot go to a custom slaughter facility, have an animal slaughtered, and then sell that product to another person without the risk of legal ramifications, okay? And so there's pros and cons to that. There's actually an act in Congress, being introduced in Congress right now, that would change that. But as of right now, you can't take an animal to custom slaughter and sell it to somebody legally. So that would be my answer to that. There are rumors that the beef industry will continue to go through a shortage in the months ahead. What do you see? That is not the case. They are already back up to at least 95 to 99% production capacity. They think by the middle of July, they will have the pipeline restocked. The issue we're going to have is, what's going to food service, what's going to retail. That's the mix issue we have trouble figuring out, because so many people used to eat out. About half the meals were eaten out of the home, and now about 80% are eaten in the home. trying to figure out where to send product is a product problem. So there's not necessarily a shortage, but there is a allocation issue. So if you'll look at beef prices right now, box beef prices is half of what it was 2 weeks ago. Fed cattle prices are up to basically what they were pre-COVID. So that's not going to be a major issue. So, okay. What's the minimum head to use live vaccine on? You can buy it in 5-dose vials, if that makes any sense. So if you had 5 head, or if you wanted to do it to 1, you can. You just need to throw the rest of it away because it doesn't last more than about an hour. They're good. Steve Chandler got a good question. Many producers claim they vaccinated their cattle at the markets. Are they stretching the truth? And what protects the integrity of our markets and value added back 45 markets? That is a legitimate question. And I will tell you, every market I know where somebody makes a claim that their cattle have been vaccinated, weaned, if they get complaints back on those cattle, they will go back to that producer, really look at it closely. And if they cannot verify what they've done, or if they suspect they're not doing what they're told to, they will not let them sell cattle in those markets. So a lot of that has to do with the integrity of the market as well. And so they need to be doing things and verifying what's being claimed. The best way to do that, I think, is to go into one of these verified sales. They actually do check a little bit closer there than just somebody standing up in the auction and claiming they've done something. You're raising female composite cows. What's the best marketing approach? That probably is direct market those females or special sales. And so if I have a local market that has a production sale or a special female sale, and these cattle kind of fit, I would try to sell them in that. Or you can try to, if you understand the value of them, try to sell them at home. But those are the two that I would think would work best for that. What's the difference between black and red Angus? Genetically, there's not a whole lot different between them. The difference is the blacks have the certified Angus program and the perception that they are superior genetics. And the other issue we run into is you don't necessarily have to be Angus to be sold as certified Angus. You just have to be black. To be sold as a red Angus, you have to be actually red Angus. And so because certified Angus beef was around before they started all these PVP programs, they grandfathered them in, and they do not have to actually prove that they are Angus. They just have to prove that they're black. So that's kind of an interesting little difference there. If you want to learn more about the process of retained ownership, where should I go and who should I talk to? That we do have some publications on retaining ownership. That same website, talk about beef.tamu.edu. I'd be glad to visit with you about it as well, Reed. If you want to contact me, my email address is rgill@tamu.edu. And be glad to visit with you about it. There's several things to think about there. Any other questions? Y'all had some good questions. I appreciate that.
I think they'll be happy to know, based on some of the questions, that our topic next month is going to be animal health stuff.
Okay.
We'll go through
That'd be good.
herd health plan and a lot of this other stuff that y'all talked about. So I think it's good.
It all ties together. That's the good part. I think that is important to think about. What you do with your cow herd health plan will directly impact the health plan that you can implement on your calves. And so keep that in mind as you're developing your cow calf herd health plan. Make sure you're protecting them against enough pathogens that they pass those antibodies on to the calves and provide some protection. I won't get into next week's program, but there's a plug for it.
Perfect. You want to talk a little bit about those? I mean, you're welcome, and I can share it as well. But that webinar series that y'all are doing.
Okay. We are doing a webinar series. It started after the COVID issues started disrupting packing plant output. And there was so much misconception about what was going on and who was causing what and who was cheating who. And imports were killing our market and a bunch of other stuff that just really wasn't accurate. We also got into discussions of the import side of it, the checkoff side of it, a bunch of other things. But it's called the intersection of cattle and beef. If you'll just search that or go to North Dakota State University is actually the group that's hosting the webinar. If you'll do that search, you can register for those. We've gone almost the entire month of May and June. We're now on our 12th webinar. We're doing 2 a week through the end of June. And so we're about to wrap that series up. But I will tell you, I've learned more in that series than I ever dreamed I could, because we don't always expose ourselves to a lot of these issues. But it's the intersection of cattle and beef. And I would encourage you to listen to those seminars. Some people say it ought to be required listening for people that are in the beef business. And they have been that good. And it's not because I'm involved with them. We've just had really good speakers.
They register
Let's see what
recordings. Can they go back and listen to past? I can't.
Yes. All you have to do is register. They're all free. And John Corey just put the link up there.
Perfect.
As well in the Q&A.
And
so it's pretty easy to find.
Yeah, I'll drop it in the email that goes out with the recording for this as well. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. I'm impressed. Y'all are running this better than I am. I got somebody nervous here. He sold 20 calves private treaty to individuals and a church group for self-processing. Is there any liability to the rancher? No. If you've sold a live animal to somebody else to process, then you have no liability. That's simple. And so that's something else. If it goes back to the previous question, if you don't have a federally inspected plant or a state inspected plant, sell the live animal to somebody and let them custom harvest it. That way it takes you out of the sale of meat. It allows you to, anybody can sell live cattle and they don't have to be federally inspected. So that's a way around that little loophole. And to be honest with you, I produce quite a few pasture and grass finished cattle, and we sell all of ours live. And then if they want to buy them in shares and 4 or 5 people own the same animal, they can go pick the meat up. They pay the processing, and it is their that's a big difference. So make sure you're aware of that. Larry got another good question here on the North Dakota State University of State. The Big Four can process a carcass for $200. Are there any independent local packers that match this cost? Not even close, Larry. Most of them are $450. There are some people that are saying they're paying closer to $1,000 right now to process cattle, and that is crazy. Okay. The reason the difference is there is that those individuals don't have a market for all the intestines, the organ meat, the cheek meat, the tongues, And so their costs are higher because they can't recuperate the cost of processing by selling even bones for 3 cents a pound. So they have to make up for it in actually their processing costs. And that's why the big four are so competitive on actually processing cost. Good question. All right, anything else? And Stacey, thank you for promoting that webinar series. It really is a good series, and it's more in depth than what most people ever get exposed to, and so but it's presented in a very easy to learn, understand format. So it's good. All right, have they restructured the processing plants to keep the workers safe? I'm not going to say they're safe because none of us are safe from this thing, but they have restructured the processing plants. There is now barriers between every worker. The workers do not work directly across from one another. And so that has really changed the dynamic in the processing room, in what we call the fab room, where they're cutting the muscle parts separate. Most of them have regained their capacity because they don't have as many people on each shift. They are actually having to run a Saturday shift or maybe even 2 shifts a day to get the animals processed. They are really doing their best to try to work through the backlog of cattle and try to get that done as quick as they can. So they've done it by adding more days to the work week and more shifts to the work week. They can't process 24 hours a day because they're required to break down at least for 8 hours and sanitize everything in the plant. But that's always been the case. And so that's not something new. They have to break down and sanitize the plant for foodborne pathogens. Good question, Richard. All right.
Looks like we might be to the end of questions, but this has been really, really informative. So thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Gill. It's always a pleasure, and for doing such a nice job explaining some. It's complex for sure, and so we're trying to simplify it down for us. I think that was really good. So appreciate your time today. I've been taking notes of kind of some of the questions that everybody's had. We'll get the recording process, get that uploaded, and then tomorrow you'll get an email from the system with all these links. I'm going to try to pull all these links together and get that out to you too. But if you have questions, feel free to let us know, and we'll do what we can to help you with that. Just in closing, to be the first to receive industry and market updates, join or renew your membership at tscra.org or by calling 1-800-242-7820. As I mentioned, our July Ranching 101 will still be virtual. We're working on some other virtual programs for y'all as well so that you can kind of keep this education going, and I encourage you to go listen to those the webinars that Dr. Gill mentioned, because I think those will be really beneficial to get to the bottom of some of what's been happening in our industry. Our annual convention is still scheduled to be September 15th and 16th in Fort Worth. So we hope that you all make plans to see us there, and that we'll all be able to see each other in person at that time. So with that, Dr. Gill, thank you for being here. We certainly appreciate you being here with us today, and
I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. And if anybody has any other questions, let us know. One more question about the recordings be posted. Yes, we will do that. Send that out tomorrow. You got to gig them in there. I'm not an Aggie, so I don't know if I was even allowed to say that. As much as I dislike the whole COVID thing, I like being able to attend these online, and that's been a really huge thing with our members. So I would anticipate us continuing a lot of this online education, even when we can start doing some in-person events as well. So be on the lookout, and if you have suggestions or things you'd like to hear us do, we certainly want you to let us know, because we're working for you on your behalf. So With that, we'll call this Ranching 101 done, and thank you all for being on today.